Welcome back to the spiritual download tonight. It's election night in the United States, so I'll be talking about politics tonight. It's kind of been on top of mind of most people, so I feel like tonight is the correct Tuesday to talk about politics. Um, Now, why do I feel passionate about politics, first of all, and why do I feel like I have something to say about politics? Um, So politics is, first of all, really connected to spirituality, actually. Um, it's how people interact and believe about society, right? And government. So society and government. And government is usually a key central point to how society functions. The question a lot of times in social studies is, how does the government relate with the people? And that's extremely relevant for us because in spirituality, it's not just about waking up to the transcendent realm. In spirituality, it's also about how to be a good, wise person in this life as well. So I feel like politics is kind of a manifestation of the human ego in society. So ego is not just for the individuals, but human ego gets manifested into society, and society is the culmination of all of the relationships between individuals. So society is not just you know a set of individuals. It's also how how those individuals decide to interact through culture, government, economics, and even spirituality. Usually gets manifested as religion, institutional religion. So, um, also in college, because I'm so interested in these ideas, philosophy, spirituality, both has politics pretty much as an important, key point or characteristic. Um, I decided to major in philosophy and political science in college, and basically I've always been thinking about politics and society, just out of interest, really, just because, like I said, that politics is so interconnected as to how humans interact with one another. And for me, my biggest question was, what does it mean to be human for a long time? For a long time, so that's why I'm interested in this question. And then tonight being the election, I thought it'd be a good time to come up maybe with a different point of view. What would be a unique point of view that maybe wouldn't be on the news, um, and wouldn't be, on CNN or Fox News, or even on New York Times for that matter. So this will be politics from I would say a wider perspective. Okay, so I have some notes here. I'll just be going from point to point um, as I talk. So the first point is, how does politics exist in the first place? Why does it exist? Is it human nature? Is politics human nature? And you could argue that one thing about human nature is that there's this idea of we and them. Okay, we versus them. So at first it was tribalism, right? Where we were living in bands and tribes of hundreds of people, and then our enemy, lived maybe across the river. Um, and that would be tribalism, when you believe that your tribe is better than the other tribe for purposes of survival. It's not just a mythology. It's not just a mythology. It's also a purpose of for your group to survive. In order for you as an individual to survive, you need your tribe to survive. And so that's why you would want your tribe to win over another tribe, right? Because if the other tribe wins, you know, you're not happy because they're going to overtake your land. They're going to come into your village and take your children, and things like this. So at that point, tribalism served a purpose. Now, that mentality, if that was 99.9% of our history, it's got to be deeply ingrained in our psychology, the idea of tribalism. It must be. I mean, that's how evolution works. That's how the human species evolved, was from becoming more and more sophisticated eventually. But at first, it was that tribalism. Okay. So that tribalism now, how does it get manifested through history? So tribalism basically ended when history began, when we started to have civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, and the Indus Valley civilization. We started living together and we started to record our life. Okay, so we started to live in cities and settlements, and we started to have a religion, maybe um, a common ethnicity that even spread across the land in a lot of land, meaning that you eventually become an empire, where we have the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, Mongolian Empire, and now you're moving from a small tribe, now you're a huge empire, and now that is essentially your tribe. Um, but you can see that an empire is obviously more complex than a tribe. Yet it is still we have the idea of we versus them. Okay, but now your sense of we has increased in population, you could say, going from tribe to empire. Okay, it wasn't until much later, we had to get to the medieval period, um, until around 1500 when we started to have nations, the idea of a nation. Okay, so the idea of a nation obviously did not exist through much of history. This is how we see the world today, is through nations. But please note that this is a modern concept. Okay, it's only in modernity that we have this concept of that the world is divided up into national borders or international borders. This is a new idea. So we're going to be talking about nations and what nations serve and their purposes. But first of all, note that usually people these days would say we in terms of their nation, okay, and it would not say we for all humans. Okay, so let's do a mental exercise. I want you to think about people throughout the world. Okay, just think of examples. Come up with 10 examples of say you're a woman in Canada, a man in China, a child in Uganda. Just do like 10 of those and decide whether you would say we or them. You would consider that person we or them. Okay. So probably, if you're an American, you would consider people from the Western world as we, and probably people from the global South or the third world as them, because that's kind of how the news talks. Even your teachers in school. So I try and do this as a history teacher, but I try to be careful of the pronouns that I use when talking about nations, because I assume when I say United States, I say we. Why? Because that's just a thing I identify as. It's actually random that I would identify as American versus not. Because I could easily identify as a human first, that I'm a human being first. Or I could say that I am a Minnesotan first. But when I say people from other countries, like people in China, I might say they instead of we. But why? That's also random, because I could say that we people and those people who happen to live in this nation that we call China. Okay, but know that this is a relative way to divide up the world in the first place, is through nations. Okay, so when we have this idea of a small we, like your tribe or your empire or your nation, and you have a lot of people in the them category, say if you're an American and you put everybody in Africa, everybody in the Middle East, everybody in East Asia, and everybody in Latin America as they. Okay, that's a huge population. So that wouldn't be, I would consider, not as sophisticated in intelligence, wisdom, or ethics, you could say. That would be a more selfish point of view, I would say, of the world than saying that we, as everybody, every human being alive today. Now that could be even stretched. This could be even stretched. You could say we, human beings who are alive today and who will ever live into the future. What if we say that those people are we, right? We actually humanize them when we say we versus they. We automatically humanize them in our psychology. We say that they are a part of my people. This could also be people in history. So we tend to teach history through the lens of that we're not emotionally connected to these people. Okay, I'm going to be talking about this, but this is a logical bias, a bias towards logic versus human emotion. Okay, so a big part of our society emphasizes logic overall versus other aspects of human epistemology, I guess is the word, but ways of thinking, and ways of interpreting the world. And one of those would be a spiritual lens. Now, a spiritual lens doesn't mean better than a scientific lens of interpreting the world. It's just another one, because actually you could have a spiritual point of view, that would be native, maybe from a shamanistic point of view, or you could have a spiritual view from a new age point of view. And those are two very different point of views, yet they're both spirituality. So it's hard to compare that with, a scientific point of view, because you could also say that a scientific point of view is quite advanced in terms of history and human intelligence, because modern science, kind of came out in the 1700s, not that long ago, the 1700s AD, right? And there's like 5,000 years of recorded history. And then could be 2 million, 6 million, we don't really know, years of human history. Okay. So basically spirituality existed all through all of that time. Basically humans, you could say, are a spiritual species. We don't know exactly when spirituality came into existence in a human being, but we could say that that's a rather natural part of being a human. Whereas modern science, have humans always been scientists? Or is science just what we say was invented in the 1700s? Okay, so it really depends on how we see science, and I don't believe that there's an objective viewpoint as to what science is, or the purposes that science serves, or that who is a scientist and who is not a scientist. Okay. So overall, that point, the larger your sense of we, the less selfish and more loving you are overall towards humanity in general. So spreading your love towards everybody. Now, a me-centered viewpoint would be like a more political. Would people who tend to have their whole identity into their politics, and it would be domestic politics. So that's another thing, is a lot of people assume that politics refers to just the politics within their country, their own country. Whereas, hi, Environmental Coffee House, hello. So that would be domestic news and domestic politics, and the assumption is that is all of the news that is going on in the world. Okay, so we'll be talking more about the news, but that tends to be just one perspective. Another perspective could be world news. Now that has its own bias, but now you're starting to have a greater concern for a wider variety of people, a wider group of people, by having a global perspective. Okay, so now let's dive into what a nation actually is. What is a nation and country? Now I have it also on the back, so I'll be going back and forth between my front page and my back page of notes. But what is a country? Perhaps a country is a house of cards. Okay. So for example, international borders. International borders. So have you crossed a border, say between the United States and Canada, in just north of Minnesota or just north of Montana? Or have you ever had the experience of entering into a new country and feeling like nothing has changed? Or have you like crossed the border between United States and Mexico or something, and all the border is just an office and a gate and a man standing there with a gun, and you're like, what exactly is this? Like, this supposed line has no objective significance. Maybe what a nation is this idea that people trust. Okay, because you could say, well, is the nation the people? Is the nation the people living in the nation? Well, let's think about this. What if those very same people, all 350 million Americans, were somebody else? Where all of a sudden came together and decided we are not the United States. We are the just think of a new country name, right? So because through history, people, like, countries have changed their identity, and people have shifted their national affiliation through history quite easily. So it could be that if the United States ends up falling, which could be the case in the future, your national identity could easily just shift to, say, if just say that Canada colonizes the United States. But all of a sudden you're Canadian technically now, right? And that doesn't change anything about you, really. It's just the idea that we have in our minds of confidence that the United States is truly a thing. That's an objective thing, yet it's not an objective thing. It's more of a confidence that we teach ourselves through things like history class, the news, and just table discussions as well. So talking more about the news, now there's quite a bit of a difference between the quality of political science that you would find in, say, a private college versus the quality of political science that happens on the news. Okay, so compare and contrast the sophistication of thought between Fox News and Harvard political science classes. Okay, now the assumption, if you're a Fox News supporter, what would you say? Well, the people at Harvard are liberals. Right? Well, let's see. So it's possible that people can be more advanced than you. It is possible, right? Let's just assume that it is possible that people can be more advanced than you in, say, political ideas. It's true in sports. Somebody can run faster than you. It's true at your job. Some people are better at being a lawyer than you are at being a lawyer. Why isn't it that some are better than others at thinking about politics? Just something to keep in mind. And now talking about what exactly is the news then. So if we could tune into Harvard political science classes, and that would be our source of political truth, right? Which truth is a whole other topic, because that's not really what most people care about. Most people are care about their politics, their political party, their nation, and their religion. They're not necessarily concerned about, oh, what is the truth? I'm going to go search for the truth through valid sources like universities, or from a life, a self-development coach, or a philosopher in history. No, most people don't seek truth in that way. Or a lot of people don't even get don't even have that drive to seek for truth, right? And I've always wondered that, like, why why do some people just kind of assume that what they're taught is true and that they're comfortable with that? That's always kind of surprised me. I've always been, concerned with what really is the truth, and I've gotten in pitfalls many many times, but sometimes, and I'm sure I'm in pitfalls now still because I've always been in pitfalls. But the cool thing is to identify the pitfalls that you're in, to say, oh yes, I am in a pitfall of an idea, and that I've now discovered an idea that's more true, like through, you could be in philosophy or science or spirituality. That could be the case. Okay, so the news, though, you could say is based off of, the capitalism perspective of making money. So the news, it's more important to think of it as a business or as an entertainment business. Okay, so the news, depending on which, that's also the thing, not putting the news all into one basket. The news, um, there's like the New York Times, there's Fox News. I would say the New York Times is overall more objective than Fox News. But then there are sources out there that are more objective than the New York Times, where, um, it would be sources that would take into consideration a wide variety of viewpoints to arrive at truth. One would be meditation. Okay, one would be meditation. So, a lot of people don't meditate in life, in America, for example. So, some people wouldn't consider meditation to be a legitimate field in which to seek truth. So, um, so the news, you could say, is embedded with business entertainment and social media as well. So social media can also grab our attention for purposes of business. The news is more about sensationalizing everything, rather than actually caring about what's true. It's less about the lives that regular people are living and more about the extremes. What's the extreme? What's noteworthy? Um, so like the news, right? The news is inherently about the extremes of what's going on in the world. Most people are living safe lives, and there's not much noteworthy about it from the perspective of news, but from like a human heart perspective, or just being interested in culture, right? Like what is happening across the world. Okay, so and the other thing I want to say about social media is a lot of people are talking about the social dilemma, which is a documentary on Netflix, which I have not seen, but a lot of people are saying that it's going to be a documentary that will be extremely powerful in deconstructing social media and seeing that social media has taken a lot of the power away from people being independent thinkers and from people being psychologically healthy. Okay, so we want to be more psychologically healthy, and more of an independent thinker. So trying to think about how much social media and news are we ingesting, and are we putting ourselves in the environment of? So just something to think about. Now, uh, politics often is about belief and not about truth, like I mentioned. So your beliefs are tied to often our ego and our group mentality versus the truth, which would be an epistemology. Again, the word epistemology meaning truth. So how do you know that your beliefs are true? Is the question I have written down. So think about, how do you know that your beliefs are true? Now, probably if you're listening to this channel, you've probably thought about your beliefs, but some people have not, right? So asking those people, how do they know that their belief is true? Ultimately, people who have not thought about it, it comes from an outside source. It comes from an outside source, such as parents, schools, church, and the news, social media. Okay, so things like that could convince us of what truth is from that environmental perspective. Now, if you do a self inquiry into your own beliefs and how do I know that my beliefs are true, that could lead you into a pretty uh, pitch black room of nothingness, which is completely okay because most beliefs most beliefs don't have a strong footing. Oftentimes, reality is so complicated and so amazing that a little phrase that describes your belief system does not describe all of that, right? So, life is extremely complex. Truth is extremely complex. So, human beliefs tend not to be able to describe the whole truth or what the truth even is. Okay. Now, next to think about is what is the purpose of politics? What really is the purpose of politics? Um, a political party is basically a theory as to how politics works. Okay, so you could say, what do conservatives? What is their theory of politics? And liberals, what is their theory of politics? And to think a little bit more about this, I would encourage you to think about spiral dynamics. I have a few episodes on this channel about spiral dynamics. Um, to make humans crazy, politics. Yes. So politics is kind of the manifestation of human craziness, you could say, and all of it's good and all of it's bad. You know. Yes. So now, what about the raw data, though? So political parties could be theories as to how politics works, but what about if we just worry about the raw data of society? What is the raw data of society? How do you go out and study things like health, wellness, um, uh, health, wealth, wellness, happiness, things that actually matter, right? So, what is the purpose of politics? Really, what is it? Is the point the people? Or because in the past, it was about God and the king, how the king and God have some special relationship, and that everybody else in society needs to respect that and listen to what the king has to say because he has the direct line to God from their perspective of God. Right? That sounds pretty absurd when you think about it. It's a little bit more complex than that, but eventually, um, as it grew in complexity, we got democracy and things like presidents and things like this. Um, but when we see politics from that perspective, there really doesn't seem to have a cohesive purpose to it. It seems like we're still living in like a sports mentality where it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. And so, what really is the purpose of that? Um, we don't see it as a whole group of people coming together. Now, the Republicans feel that they need to do that from their perspective based on their theory of politics, and the Democrats need to do that because of their theory of politics. And the fear is that their views are so different that is there a commonality at all, which would be America, which would be America. Theoretically, what we would see is America equals the similarities and the common ground between Republicans and Democrats. But that's becoming less and less the case. It's becoming much more the case of we have the Democrats and the far left. They seem to differ as well, and then we have the Republicans and the Trump supporters. Um, these people seem to have their isolated perspectives uh, of politics. So then what does America mean? That becomes the question. What does America mean when we have such huge political differences? Now, what if we see a completely different perspective of politics? So you could think of, and I have this down somewhere else, but what does politics look like from the perspective of someone across the world? So, what does politics look like from a woman in India? Is that different than your politics? Right? Quite a bit different. What about a man in Russia? What is his politics? And then someone living in the Amazon rainforest. What is their politics? Okay. So politics tends to be based on where you are geographically and your own nation. And but what if we begin to have a cohesive purpose of politics, a cohesive um, uh, like point of society, the purpose of society? We could say that it should be happiness, or it could be self-actualization. Could be the purpose of politics, but it's not yet. You know, maybe in the future we start to think that the purpose of a human is to become self-actualized, and that becomes the purpose of our politics. Um, but maybe ultimately you could say love between everybody. It could be the purpose of politics. So it just could advance more and more. Um, okay. Now, so I have this also in my notes. Reality is extremely complex. Why would we focus on Democrats versus Republicans? So we see that reality is super complex and super expansive, and it's so like infinite that our human minds can't wrap our heads around it at all. When you experience such a huge spiritual experience, or having a big experience in meditation, for example, and you're like, how the Democrats have no way to explain this. The Republicans have no way in their worldview to explain a spiritual experience of oneness and absolute love, right? So why do we say, okay, well, I'm going to use this perspective with politics then? But what if we started politics from that reality? Okay, that reality that we experienced in meditation, that we verified, okay, that's real through a subjective experience. Okay. Environmental coffee house. Was the choice of Adidas t-shirt a political statement? Good. So, no, it wasn't on purpose. No significance of wearing an Adidas t-shirt. Now, but is it political? So no, I did not intentionally wear the t-shirt, but is it political? Well, yes. Of course it's political. Almost everything is political in a sense. Like me not wearing like a Hindu scarf kind of says that I'm not a part of that religion, which would be a political statement. Basically saying that you are or are not in a religion, that is a political statement. So a lot of things that we wear is a political statement, even like the masks that we wear. And some people have statements on their masks. So right when COVID started happening, that was kind of interesting. Um, I live in a small town, so I didn't see the fashion of masks beginning right away. But I assume in the cities, what began to happen was that people started to buy masks that were connected to some, basically like a meme. What is a meme? It's a social idea. It's an idea out there in society, and tends to be political. Even going to public school, you could say, is a political statement of some sort. Paying your taxes is a political statement in some sort. So a lot of things, more things are political than we'd like to assume. Even living in a city versus a rural area is political. So it goes, yeah. So I didn't think you would. You were too sweet to want to put this subliminal message. To be honest, I don't read much of the news. I have no idea what you're referring to. For me, this yeah, I think you're right. Like, you're judging me correctly. I don't think about this stuff For me, it's just a T-shirt that I bought. Now, I'm. Do I know much about Adidas? I'm sure they do a lot of bad things in the world, and I'm sure that they do a lot of good things. So I'm not giving a thumbs up nor a thumbs down towards Adidas. It's just a T-shirt. But yes, so all right. Next, we have how much has the president actually influenced your wellness? So first, so a lot of things about politics tends to be about one person, not just Donald Trump. When we had, yeah, namaste. See you, Sandy. Um, uh, Even when Obama was president, everything was about him. Now, when Donald Trump became president, everything was about him. Now, if you were not watching the news, nor if you followed social media, and basically if you lived in a cabin in the woods, or say that you did, a social media cleanse, and you didn't know much about what was going on in the news for 4 years, how much would the president have influenced your life? Okay, so that perspective now take into consideration. Now, what is the issue then? Is the issue how much what the president is doing? He is doing this, he's doing that, or which angers me or makes me happy, or is it that we have our own behaviors, our own actions that are connected to this unhealthy thinking about the president, about that person? So is it more that we actually have more control than we think about our wellness in regards to political thinking? It seems like there's a lot of unhealthiness when we're so invested in one political party, in one perspective. It tends to anger us. If we tend to have a wider perspective as to what politics actually is, and we see that really we're one people rather than one political party or one nation, that it would be a healthier perspective, and that would lead to more wellness in your life, because you see that the president doesn't actually have that much influence on your life, and because the president is one person who's also involved in all these infinite factors of reality. So reality is not this. COVID happened, President Trump didn't do anything about it, and now COVID is terrible. That's actually not what happened. Okay. First of all, we don't know exactly what coronavirus actually is. You could say a lot of people have differing opinions as to what COVID is and how bad it is. And then with saying that a pandemic is to be blamed on one person is to deny what a pandemic actually is, right? So really, you could say a pandemic is happening, and everybody's being influenced, and that we look to certain people to make decisions. And if it's a pandemic, maybe the president is not the right person to go to have them help us. Maybe there's other institutions like the World Health Organization to go to. Okay, there's a pandemic going on. World Health Organization, can you help us? And can you let some of our world leaders know what they should do? Okay, so it would be a separate idea to say that the president didn't do A or B. That's kind of the main thing that I'm getting at. So just saying that I can control my thought patterns more than I think about politics is very important. Okay, so for many, politics is a patch to self-actualization. They just don't know it yet. Sure, yes, is a patch to self-actualization. It's a path. Yes, a path to self-actualization. It could be, I think I know what you're saying. I think I know what you're saying. Um, but yes, politics could be a tool that we use to self-actualize. It's just a matter of beginning to have a healthier perspective on politics, I would say. Yep. Okay, so next is um, who holds the real power then? So if we say that really politics is dependent on your own mental health, that allowing things like news and social media to influence our own mental health and spiritual health, then where does the power lie? Does the power lie in the corrupt government, or does the power lie in yourself? So the answer is the power is in you for your wellness. Okay. Really, most governments, um, they and societies and economies, they produce a decent standard of living. Um, if we kind of follow the rules and we do well in school and we are responsible, we're able to find a job and have a decent life. Um, Now, what tends to happen is then we start playing the blame game, and we say that this representative or person in the government is not doing X. I want them to change that so my life can be better. Okay, well, that's a material point of view. What if the actual step is to look within and ask, how can I self-actualize? How can I self-develop? How can I become more wise? How can I improve my wellness? Because if you want to be well, you don't need to be as rich as you think. Really having a middle class lifestyle is more than enough to live a spiritual and self actualized life. Um, so it's very important to know that the power is not in the hands of the corrupt government. Um, it's actually in yourself. And that's actually another powerful statement to say, well, if that's true, you could stay at home and just work on yourself. Or I just said the power's in you. Go protest with some friends. Maybe you and some friends have a perspective on racial inequality, right? And you want to go and protest for Black Lives Matter. So that is coming from the power from you and not from giving the power to the corrupt government. Okay. That's saying that I have political power. And so, from my perspective, when I choose to stay home and meditate, I'm making a political statement. I'm making a political statement. Even if people know that I'm doing that or not. I'm basically making a political statement by choosing to meditate rather than watch another hour of news. That's a political statement. Because I'm saying there's actually more truth to be found in my meditation than in the hour of watching the news. Okay. So also in the news, have you ever thought about this? What deserves to be reported versus not reported? So this is where, um, if we say that if we give the truth to the businesses, okay, we say, okay, the purpose of the news is to cover what is truly happening. If that's the goal of the news, which most people believe, and that's what it should be. But again, the news is business. So really it's about being loud and making money, overall, right? I know I'm not saying that there's, I think there are good journalists out there, but overall, um, it tends to be about business. So now they choose to report on things that are loud rather than things that are quiet. So things that are quiet, tend to be just the regular things that happen in life, and the regular things that happen in life could be actually really good, really beautiful. These are often things that are happening on people's video blogs on YouTube. These are people who are doing things on their Instagram stories. These are people who are just out for a Sunday walk. Why isn't that being covered in the news? People going out for their Sunday walk and enjoying nature. Is that less valid than what Trump tweeted? which one is more valid? Well, the news tends to think that the Trump tweet is more important than people's Sunday walk. So, all right. So, how do people in other countries view politics? We talked about this. So when we say that politics in another country is unique from my politics, and that they that would mean that politics is very cultural. Okay, so like I said, that politics is usually covered through just domestic politics, the politics happening in your country. That basically proves that politics is dependent on your culture, which makes politics relative. So please note that. But also, maybe I did write this down. Okay. I want you to admit this thing, that you don't know what it is like to be somebody across the world. Okay. So, like thinking about that woman in China, you do not know, just admit, you do not know what it's like to be that woman in China. The kid in Tanzania, just admit that you do not know what it is like to be that kid in Tanzania. Okay. Now, the news tends to try and be very objective, and it assumes that it knows quite a bit about the lives of people across the world. Okay. But again, admit that we don't know what it's like to be that person. I can't go into their head and see what it's like to have that perspective. And now I remember where it is. All right. So, and now that's true within the United States. So I have written here in the back. I don't know. I admit that I don't know what it's like to be a Trump supporter. Okay. So, I identify as very liberal. It's just a relative thing. There's nothing important about that. But so, from my personal perspective, I don't know what it's like to be a Trump supporter. I might assume, from my perspective, what it is like, but I'm misinterpreting the complexities of what it is to be an actual person with a heart, with a soul, with a brain, with their whole story of their whole life, and to be a Trump supporter. I don't know what it's like. I have no idea. So that actually should, when I admit that I don't know what it's like to be somebody else, that tends to lead to less judgment. So admitting that I don't know what it's like to be a Trump supporter, and I don't know what it's like to be a kid in Tanzania, that should lead to a little bit more empathy towards those people. Just saying that I don't know their life experience. Maybe choosing to be a Trump supporter was the best choice for them. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be them. Okay. So let's move back to this side. Okay, politics and history. Is there one objective history? Is there one history? So I teach history in high school, and I can tell you that really the way that teachers teach history is not correct in a way that would align with what's actually happening in reality. So what I just talked about with the Sunday walks and things like this, that's what reality is things that are just happening out in regular life. That's reality, right? But we tend to have this perspective from the news where we think, oh, we want to just cover the extremes, that which is most important, that which will get the headlines, that people will read about or something. That's the news perspective. Okay. And that's also true about history. It's the same thing. History does the same thing. History doesn't cover much about the regular life of the people in medieval Europe, the regular person living in Egypt. Okay. It tends to be, first of all, from the modern perspective of that the world was blocked up by nations. Okay, so it's from our perspective that the world is divided up into nations. Okay, the people living in the past, basically a different culture. You could assume kind of equate that living in the past was like living in another foreign culture, even if they are, European, or they seem like to be from the same culture as you. Just because of time, it's more accurate to say that they're really just living in a different culture at that point. So we don't know what it's like to be those people in history. We don't really know what they did. From the historical perspective, to know what people did, they would have had to have written it down. Otherwise, it basically didn't happen from the historical perspective. But we know that we know with confidence in history, a lot of mostly just regular things happened that aren't quote unquote noteworthy. So that's really what history is. So again, the question is, what is worth covering in history class and what isn't worth covering is extremely cultural and relative. So even talking about the Civil War in America, rather than not talking about the history of Indonesia, for example, plus just talking about the history of Indonesia is an inherently Western perspective, because we're talking about, well, what is history? Well, it's kind of a science which was invented in Europe. And then Indonesia, well, Indonesia had to become a country because the idea of a country, came out of Europe, and Europe colonized the rest of the world. So the world kind of had to adapt to this whole idea of what a nation is. So Indonesia, yeah, they had to become a nation. And the idea of history, again, is relative. Okay, so really, is there one history? Well, like they say, the history books is written by the powerful. Okay, so really, the idea of what our history is just a perspective. There are millions of different perspectives as to what actually happened or what is worth talking about in history. All right, so next, what is the role of government? So to conclude that point, what should go in the textbooks? What should be written in the textbooks? Well, what's written in the textbooks is dependent on the powerful. And who has the power? So thinking about who wrote the textbook, we have to think about, well, who has the power? And then what is the role of government? What is the role of government? It goes back to my idea is, what is the purpose of politics? Okay. So some people say that the government is going against their freedom, and other people think that the government is a group of people that can help us. So which one is correct? Which one is correct? Well, it depends on your perspective, right? Depends on your perspective. For some, the government, for them, was, this social worker who helped them. From other people, the government is the FBI agent who came to your house to take away your gun. Okay, so what is the government? Well, it depends on your perspective, what the government actually is, or who the government is. And saying that it's good or bad, again, is relative. But now, if you're thinking about what is the purpose of politics, and we want to say that self-actualization is the purpose of politics, the question then can be, how can the government help us self-actualize? Okay, so the government could become an institution like school or church, where the question is, okay, how can church, how can school, and how can the government help the people self-actualize? Okay, next. So the news and politics and history do not consider inner subjective experience or feelings. Okay, so I have this. The news has a bias towards logic over emotion and subjectivity. The news and history and social media believe that it is objective. And the idea of objective has bias towards logic over emotion and over subjectivity. Okay, so I want you to really think about what feels the most real. Is it your subjective experience, or is it all of these different stories, different perspectives on social media, on the news, and everyone's arguing with each other? Everyone else thinks that they're right. Well, if everyone thinks that they're right, then what is right? Right? Okay. Another perspective on government and society would be pragmatism versus idealism. Okay. Um, so when one has the idea that, okay, well, what is the purpose of politics? Could we come up with a plan where government aids us in our self-actualization process? Is that idealism or is that pragmatism? Most people would say that that's idealism, right? In my opinion, I think it's pretty practical. I think that we should have steps that has the government help us out to self-actualize, to meditate, to eat well. I don't know the right laws or whether there should be even laws about that stuff. But the question is, how can the government help us? Right? For me, that's a practical thing. For most people, that's not practical. What they see as practical is, how can we decrease unemployment? For them, that's most practical, and that tends to be an economic or political point of view. But for me, I tend to be an idealist. But for me, I'm not an idealist. I'm a realist. It's all depending on perspective there. And then another thing is short-term versus long-term good. Now, when we're stuck in this idea of the news is describing politics, we tend to think short-term. We tend to think this year, next year, and the end of the political cycle. Okay, but for me, in my perspective, the long-term goal of society is the purpose of politics. So for me, I want politics to be thinking about 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And we should be making choices today to help us achieve those goals that we want to achieve in 50 or 100 years. Okay. But when we have these ideas, they've got to be way different, completely different from what we're hearing in the news. We have no idea the potential of what humans could do on this planet. We have no idea what that could be. Okay. But if we actually start making plans, okay, what type of world do we want to live in 50 years? And assume that everybody's going to kind of join together and that we're going to create a great world. What if that's true? And what if we had government join us in doing that? Right? Okay. So we're talking about what America is or what a nation is. Now, the question was, what is America exactly? The Democrats have a different perspective. The Republicans have a different perspective. Independents have a different perspective. So please note that the term American is dependent on each person's perspective. So the term American can be very flexible and a fluid identity. Okay. So like Muslim women living in the United States are Americans. The blue collar guy with the Trump hat is an American. Me, a left wing teacher, you could say, living in the Midwest, a spiritual person, whatever that means. I'm also an American. So, what does it mean to be an American? Is there an objective identity? No, there's not an objective identity. It's really dependent on, because it's so flexible, it could be up to the perspective of each person. All right, so next. So studying history can be helpful, again, with an open mind as to what history could or could not explain. But when we do study history, we get to see that there are cycles of prosperous and orderly times, and then they dip into chaos and economic depression. Okay, so a lot of history is filled with basically economic booms and economic busts, but not just economics, but also when we had an orderly government versus a chaotic government. So in the United States, we've been having a 250-year cycle of good governance. That could either continue or that could end. We don't really know. But it's also not the end of the world. Okay, we'll be talking about this towards the end. But it's not the end of the world if an idea ceases to exist. That, this idea of the United States, that could shift in the future, even either what the United States is, or whether it is even a thing, whether we do continue considering it a nation. Okay, that could be, because it's so fluid. American is a fluid identity. We like to think that it's this people on this land, but that could be anything. This 350 million people on this land, we could become anything. We could become anything. We could decide that this idea of the United States of America is getting in our way to our purpose, our ultimate purpose as a people on this land. Another perspective was the Native Americans. Are we saying that America is the best idea for these people on this land? Or what if we begin studying, well, how did the Native Americans do it? Is that a better way? Okay. Right. So what if the United States were to fragment into, I'm not saying we don't know what's going to happen with America. We really don't know. But if it does start to fragment, maybe in 10, 50 years, okay, again, would that be the end of the world? Would that be? Well, when we study history, we know that when empires fall, like the Roman Empire, yes, the Roman Empire fell, but was it the end of the world? No, right? When the Egyptian Empire fell, or when the Mongolians' empire fell, what was that the end of the world? No, right? History, human beings, we all continue. Okay, which will lead me to an idea I have down here. But let me continue to the next point here on my list, which is, what is freedom? Okay, what is freedom? Freedom is an idea that Americans like to talk about, right? Now we tend to think that freedom is a personal thing. But what if freedom is that which makes us, a group of people, as free as possible as a group instead? Well, which one would you rather have? Would you rather live in a free society, or would you rather live in a kind of a crappy society where, I think I'm free, maybe everyone else is screwed, but from my perspective, I'm free? Well, what if you had just a better life? Living in a better country, living in a better school system, living in a better community, living in a happier place. What if that's freedom, right? Now, how a lot of people think about freedom, my freedom, you're tending to step on other people's toes when you're practicing that freedom, okay? So we can't have freedom at the expense of another's freedom, okay? That does not lead to a good society. Okay. And basically, freedom is associated with power. So those who are in power have the most freedom. Those who do not have a lot of power do not have a lot of freedom. And in this society, power, comes from our historical legacy of colonization, which comes from men of European descent. So men of European descent tend to have more power these days because of the historical legacy, but that could change tomorrow. What if we decide that we want to live in a more equal society tomorrow? Well, that could happen today with the election. I don't know. Okay. No. Okay. America. So again, it's not the end of the world if America were to fragment, because when we come up with the idea of America, when we have it in our heads, we think of capitalism, but what does that capitalism equate to? Well, it equates to an unsustainable relationship to the environment. Okay, so I would say the idea of America is inherently unsustainable, not just politically, but environmentally as well. The way that America does its farming, the way that America treats its poor people, the way that America treats other countries, it's inherently unsustainable because it's based on selfishness, to be frank. The idea of America, or an America first, which is the rhetoric on the right, of course, is selfish. Saying that we're the most important, it's just being selfish, and it leads to actually a less prosperous world overall when one country is selfish and chooses selfishness over relating to everybody around the world and trying to make the whole world a little bit better for everybody. But also, so then I have, what is the goal of society? I've talked about that. So I'm going to go on to this idea that when we do study history, we see that overall life has been continuing to get better and better. All right, much love. Yeah, see ya. See ya, conscious Catwoman. Thank you. Really, life. When we look at history, life has continued just to get better and better. Yes, there have been some hiccups. You could say World War II was a hiccup. And if you're the perspective of the Native Americans when the Europeans came to America, you could say, man, I don't really see much, evolution or progress happening. But when you look at overall across the world, from the last 10,000 or the last 100,000 years, you could say that materially, life is getting better and better with a few hiccups. So that's important to think about in politics because we need to contextualize it. We got to say, well, life is getting better and better, so how can we make it even better? How can we make it even better? And coming from that perspective, rather than coming at it from anger all of the time and blaming other people for living these so-called crappy lives. I see people living really good lives materially. What if we turned that material wealth into a tool for self-advancement and spirituality, though? That's a whole other perspective. I don't think America is there yet to talk about that. Maybe in 5-10 years, to talk about the actual spiritual wellness of the people and the overall happiness of the people of America. But we're not there yet to talk about that. But we're still thinking that getting that which is material makes us happier. But I don't think that's the case. Another perspective is, we were taught that democracy is the best form of government, but how do we know? Okay. How do we know that democracy is the best? Well, first of all, we have to have some agreed standpoint on which to define democracy. Good luck, right? Good luck having everybody agree upon what democracy is in real life. Is this election in the United States, is that democracy? Okay, really think about what's going on in the United States right now. Is what's happening in the United States democracy? Okay. Yes and no. Yes and no. Okay. No. But then if you ask people around America, well, which part of this is democracy? Well, from Trump supporters' perspective, they think that this election is democracy. Democracy is putting Trump in power. Okay. Democrats don't believe that. Okay. And there are a million other perspectives as to what democracy actually is. And why do we assume that democracy, if we think it's the best, why do we assume that we should spread democracy all across the world? Okay. Well, did that work with Christianity during colonization? No. It led to 90% of Native Americans dying with Europeans coming over with their diseases. One of the main motivations was Catholicism, okay, spreading Catholicism across the world. How did that end up? Well, yes, we have Catholicism all over Latin America today, but at what cost? You could say a lot of terrible things happened. You could also say a lot of good things happened, though. But a lot of sad things happened during colonization. And saying that, well, look at the end result. Now we have Catholicism. It's like that's oversimplifies it. It completely oversimplifies it. Okay. All right. That's it. Those are all of my notes. Awesome. Okay. So to kind of conclude here, so yes, politics is important. I love you too, CJ. Love you too. So yes, politics is important, and what's important about it is to contemplate it and not letting um, all these outside perspectives influence us. We want to have an open mind and an open heart towards politics, because we want to have an open mind and open heart towards our relationships with others, right? Um, so politics doesn't need to be what we learn from the news. It can literally be a tool for us to learn about human nature and how to love others more as well. Okay, it, things like politics, history, science, they're kind of manifestations of the human intellect, the human ego, whatever we define as human, whether we see it as good or bad. All these characteristics of humans. Well, one of the big goals here is to learn about what is human, what does it mean to be human, and where in my being is the humanness. Where in my being is the humanness, and how could I actually go beyond the limits of this humanness? So studying things like politics is huge. Like being able to go beyond politics. It's basically what we were just talking about. How to use politics to go beyond it. You know, usually it depends on studying the philosophy of or the purpose of, right? When we find out that there is no purpose of politics from most people's perspectives, that's got to turn on a light in our brain and say, well, there's no cohesive idea as to what politics is. So now I can contemplate it from its root. Really, what is politics? What is its purpose? And why does it exist? Right. So, all right. So, I want to say good luck to everybody in relation to how you deal with the election. Okay. From my perspective, I don't listen to much news. Um, part of the reason is what I explained here in this video. But I can tell that this is going to be a very emotional one. Again, this is being recorded on the night of the election, so I don't know the end result or anything. But I just want to send wellness to everybody, especially those living in America during this time of the election. It's going to be extremely emotionally rocky. But when we have this wider perspective, our ship doesn't get as rocky. When we see, when you can see the sky, and have just a bigger perspective on reality, our ship doesn't need to rock in the sea in this, stormy weather of politics. So, all right. Yes, I wish you wellness and I wish you peace. And I'll see you next week. Bye.